Okay, Dad, today is Wednesday, April 24th, and I think we need to talk about this massive foreign aid bill that just passed.
Sure.
So it's total $95 billion. So can you tell us what this is all about and what does it mean for the countries that are receiving the aid? And what does it mean, maybe a bigger question, what does it mean for the United States and sort of its position in the world and its power and all that good stuff?
Yeah. Well, I guess you could say, first of all, it shows that there's no change of direction. Okay. The U.S. is doubling down on all its commitments. There was a total, let's see, $61 billion for Ukraine, $26 billion for Israel, and $10 billion for Taiwan. And there may have been some change for other things, but that's basically it. Um, it was held up for the longest time, I think much longer than anybody expected it to be held up. And the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, right, was bargaining for border security. Was making the argument, which I think was probably found a very receptive audience through much of the electorate. That why are we spending money on these foreign countries when we're not securing our own border? And at some point, what was it, a couple months ago, that actually the Democrats went farther than they ever had before. You could point out that there's certainly flaws, but they did make an offer, a better offer on the border than they'd ever made before.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, the Speaker Johnson rejected it, along with the Republicans that he represented. Now, okay, it's been passed with the full support of Speaker Johnson and with no concessions on the border. It just seems like a total disaster, right?
How did that happen? How did he flip flop?
I think the number one culprit is Donald Trump. He was against this back then, and I think Mike Johnson understood that it was dangerous to cross Donald Trump. That he has a lot of support within the party, a lot of support, among some very fervent support among Republican voters. Yeah, Donald Trump flip flopped. He did. And it doesn't surprise me. I think it surprised a lot of people. But I've just seen him do that on so many things that I don't think you ever can rely on him. And he's just not, he's not consistent. These positions are not that he, expresses from time to time. They can be very encouraging, and they can be, sometimes, very right and correct, like he was right to oppose this, but they're just not based on deeply held convictions. It just seems clear to me.
Is there somebody that is pushing Donald Trump and changing his mind? Like, is it the Israeli lobby? His son-in-law is Jared Kushner.
Well, I'm sure he's always been subjected to those pressures. But what was it? It wasn't too long ago that Donald Trump met with Hungarian President Viktor Orban. And at that point, he said, not a cent for Ukraine. And I think you may have remembered that. But then it was just like a couple of days later, he said, but maybe we could give him loans. And that's the gimmick that we ended up with. That was the supposed, concession that Donald Trump was wrangled from, Mike Johnson, or from, they say, okay, well, if we can make part of it, and it's only part of it, loans, then I can support this.
So what part of it is a loan?
I don't know exactly what part of it is. It may be there's supposed to be $14 billion that goes directly for weapons that are going to be sent to Ukraine now or in the near term. And it may be for that, but it's just a portion. It's not the whole 61 billion. And the thing is, it's meaningless because it's clear that Ukraine is completely incapable, of paying back loans. The only way you could say the idea, okay, is I guess that these dreamers on the pro-Ukraine side say that, well, Ukraine will take back the Donbass, and the Donbass is rich in minerals and whatever, and then they'll be able to, then the U.S. will be able to seize those resources and pay back the loans in that way. But it's not going to happen.
Right.
It's just never going to happen.
Right. I mean, this government may not exist by the end of the year. So
right.
The idea of the loan being repaid seems...
No, it's absurd. It's just a gimmick. It's just a fig leaf.
It would have to be a massive premium on that loan.
Right. Yeah, so it's very disappointing. It's clear it wasn't very popular among certainly the Republican base, and I think like the opposition to um, support for Ukraine among the Republican base is real and significant, and I think probably Tucker Carlson has a lot to do with it. Like I said earlier, um, Tucker Carlson and Colonel Douglas McGregor.
Hmm.
And in fact, what was it? The Mitch McConnell, the minority leader in the Senate, actually just recently blamed Tucker Carlson for delaying it. For
I think I saw that. Yeah.
yeah, so there was some opposition in the final vote. There was over 100 Republicans voted against it. Um, Not a single Democrat. Which
Yeah.
again, we're talking about this, rising anti-Israel sentiment within the base on the Democratic side, but it's not being reflected in the Congress because they just voted OAC and all these supposed radicals.
Well, why would
And
they do
not,
that? I mean,
yeah, well, why
a
would they?
couple things. I mean, like refers to a lot of the Democrats, the Democratic base here in the United States is opposed to what Israel is doing
Right,
in Palestine and Gaza. And also, traditionally, the Democratic Party has been sort of the peace party, the anti-war party, but that
right,
is clearly not the case
right.
anymore. So
Well,
now we
if
have,
you look at the longer history of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, that's not so clear.
um,
In more recent history, like the
through the
60s and the
60s, right?
70s, the Democratic Party was more the peace
But
party.
I think they were kind of
Yeah,
running on that reputation
yeah,
for a
right,
while, and I think a
right,
lot that resonates with a lot of youthful
yeah,
people that are wanting to,
yeah,
be more peaceful, and they often view the
yeah,
conservatives as more hawkish. But here, every single Democrat voted for this
right,
to continue sending. When we're talking about foreign aid, we're not talking about building bridges and
right.
handing out cookies
Yes,
to
this is not
people.
right. This is all military
This
aid.
is all military aid, right?
Well, there's a portion of like the Ukraine aid that just goes to pay salaries. I think 8 billion roughly
Okay,
goes to
well,
pay salaries.
to prop up this
Right,
phony regime,
right,
essentially,
for the purpose of the war. Right,
right? Okay, but essentially, all the money is it's all military assistance.
right.
So I mean, it's just such a huge change in the Democratic Party base from 20 years ago, 40 years ago. We talk about the 60s.
Yeah,
And do you think a lot of Democrats just are just voting blue no matter what, and
yeah.
they
Well,
don't
there's a
even
lot of
they
that.
don't
Right.
even realize what's happening? But
I think to a certain extent that's true. I mean, there are a lot of people who just point out, let's say they grew up in a Democratic voting family in the 50s or something.
mm,
And, they were labor and, dad, he always voted for the Democrats and goddamn, I'll always vote for the Democrats.
mm,
And it's silly, it's unthinking. The world's changed. The Democrats have changed.
mm,
There's some people that just keep those loyalties, just like they have a loyalty to a school. They remember what it was like, decades ago when they were there, and they'll keep on sending in the donations. And they don't understand that, no, they don't teach Shakespeare in English class anymore. They teach queer theory or whatever, but they
right.
just, so these loyalties, sometimes just never die. They only die with a person. But
I think
yeah,
I think a lot of Americans probably feel politically homeless now. I kind of feel that way as well. I mean, when we think also you're talking about Trump, and he's a big reason that this went through because he kind of flip flopped on this whole aid package.
right,
There's been a big movement here in the United States, the America First movement, which resonates with a lot of people, including myself. I like the
right,
idea, like, let's stop sending money overseas because it never ends well. Just look at the
right.
history. People die, money gets burned down the drain, and the military industrial complex and the elites just rake in billions of dollars, and everybody else suffers. It seems to be the pattern. But now Trump is not really an America First candidate, showing that he's not, if he's flip flopping and supporting this foreign aid, and also saying Biden is not supportive enough of Israel also
Right.
gives me hesitancy.
Yeah,
And then
right.
you got Biden, obviously, with this disaster in Ukraine and funding the genocide in Gaza. And then who else is there? There's RFK, who has proven to be a Zionist. It's just,
Right.
what do we do?
Right.
And it's so obviously reflective that we don't have a true democracy if, like you said, every single Democrat voted for this aid
Yeah.
bill.
Or at least none voted against
No,
it.
okay.
Some may have abstained, but
But
none voted
everybody,
against it.
nobody voted against it.
Right.
And clearly, I think something like 70-80% of Democrats oppose what's happening, what Israel
Right.
is doing in Gaza. the majority of Republicans opposed the war in Ukraine. I think probably even a majority of Democrats now. It's so none of
I
these
think it's
things.
still a majority of Democrats support it, just not as much as like they did a year ago.
Mm,
Um,
okay, well, regardless, the point is just that the
right.
majority of people, if we take the population as a whole, don't support funding Ukraine, don't support funding Israel.
Uh-huh.
But these get
It's
passed.
yeah, certainly a very large majority do not support funding them both. Some
Right.
support funding one or the other, but they were both
They were
supported.
both,
Right.
yeah. And so we had, I think it was only 15 senators that voted against, so
Right. It was a
85.
lot. Yeah, it was a little better in the House. Again, it was over 100 that voted against it. Now, some of them
How many are in the House again? 430?
454.
Okay.
Right. So this is, and for the Republicans, so it's like what 230 Republicans. So it was nearly. Well, I've heard that it was actually a majority, so it may have been like 115. Roughly half of the Republicans voted against it.
Mhm. But then in the Senate, we only had
Yeah.
15. I
Right.
think 13 Republicans and
Right.
2 Democrats, something like that. So yeah, it's very disappointing. I don't know if I have a question really right there, but
It is. I
it's
mean, it's also just shameful. I'm sure you saw the video of the applause that broke out after, or in this
Ukrainian flags
yeah
being waved
yeah,
everywhere.
the Ukrainian flags waving. Right. It's really shameful display.
Okay. So what does this mean exactly for these countries? For Israel, let's break it down. Start with Ukraine, got the largest portion. What does this mean for Ukraine? And what?
Right. Well, I think when you break it down, it ends up being like 14 billion in actual weapons going to Ukraine, and then there's a large amount, maybe an equally large amount, that goes for actually replenishing stocks in the U.S. because so many of our stocks have been depleted by the war in Ukraine, so they're dangerously low. So that's actually a good part of what it is. And then another, I think, 15 billion goes to for things like intelligence and training, various services in support of the war effort in Ukraine. And then there's also the direct economic aid that I mentioned earlier. Now, $14 billion, you have to stop and think, one of the things that Zelensky's been going on about is their lack of air defense. Give me more air defense, right?
Mm,
I can't do a Zelensky accent, so I'm not going to try.
I thought
But it's all right. Now, yeah, I went back and actually looked at like what a Patriot system costs. Actually, the proper term for a system plus, okay, there's a system. The system is the battery, not the batteries, rather. That's often misused. Okay, the launchers, and I believe there are 8 launchers typically in a system. Radar, control center, that makes up the system. And then there are the interceptors, which are the missiles that are fired, at the incoming missiles
those are
or
the Patriot
drones.
missiles,
Right, right. You can, and the interceptors together with the system make up a battery, and a single Patriot battery costs $1.1 billion. So with this 14 billion, it's actually a little less than it. You can only get 12 Patriot batteries.
Well, can you even get them?
Well, you couldn't even get them. That's the thing, because actually, if you look at it, a full complement of missiles or interceptors for each battery, it's, well, just to load the battery, like not the batteries, load the launchers. That's 32 interceptors. Right. And if you got 12 systems, you're talking about like 350 right there, which is more than half of what the US can make, in a year. So, and the thing is, like, actually a full battery is going to have more than that, because you got to have something to reload. They're not set up just to fire once. So it's, clearly we don't have it. You don't have enough. The US, it would take the US years to make enough interceptors, to provide, full batteries, 12 full batteries to Ukraine. So it just can't be done. They'll be lucky. I guess they're getting one from Germany. Maybe they'll get one from somebody else. There's just very few around. We don't have, we can make 550 a year, apparently. Now they're talking about they're going to try to boost production up to 650 a year. So again, it just falls far short of what they need. And then there's the other problem is that okay, we already gave them a number of Patriot systems. Where are they now? Why do they need them again? Because the Russians destroyed them,
Right.
and they used up the interceptors. So this is not a solution. It's
And
just
then
going to
they destroyed them when they had some more defense. Now they
right,
have nothing. So they'll
right,
get destroyed much more quickly this time. Anything we send over, right?
yeah. Right. So it's absurd. I mean, there'll be a certain amount of artillery shells, but again, our capabilities there are very limited. We can make something like 30,000 in a month, Europe 20,000 in a month. That's 50,000 in a month, but Ukraine says they need at least 150,000 a month to firing if they fire 5,000 a day. But the Russians are doing they admit like 2 or 3 times that every day. So that's just to get to a half or a third of what the Russians are doing. They would need 150,000, and Europe and the U.S. combined can only make 50,000 a month.
So then we're
Yeah,
at a ninth of what Russia's
yeah,
doing.
it's just right. So, yeah, they're talking. Well, we have a lot of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. So since we have a lot of those, we'll send them to them, and there'll be some kind of help, but not much. They can't really win a war with those. They help maybe in the rear somewhat. Probably the only weapon that they're talking about that can have any kind of impact is the ATACMS
Right.
missiles. Yeah, because they've given them some ATACMS missiles already, but they didn't give them what they call unitary warheads. They're instead just cluster warheads, which are cluster is basically anti-personnel, or it could also be used, I think, to like against aircraft that are parked on at an air base. But it's not useful against any sort of hardened target, like a bridge or
So people
so
are talking that this is going to be used as an attack on the Kerch Bridge in Crimea, right?
right, that's a possibility, and but that would just be symbolic. In the end, it would make no difference to the military effort because the Russians are close to completing, if they haven't completed, a rail line, through the land bridge. So they're basically not even using it to provide logistical support anymore.
Mm.
It's going to create an inconvenience to tourists and
Well,
residents of Crimea.
it also just means that Russia is going to take more territory because Russia said, like, well, if you use these weapons, then that means we have to go deeper to create a larger buffer zone, right? So the ATACMS, I think, have a range of 170 miles. I think is what
Roughly,
I
yeah, 300 kilometers, so like 170, 180 miles.
Right. So now Russia is saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're saying, well, now we have to go deeper into Ukraine because
Right,
the United States is giving
right,
the Ukrainians longer range capabilities to strike Russian territory. So,
right.
so really
Yeah,
what this means is this money is going to, it might buy the Ukrainians a little bit more time, but ultimately it'll mean that more Ukrainians will die and Ukraine will lose more territory.
right, right.
And, and then another thing
It,
that,
and they also just point out that the Russians have proved very adept at neutralizing these different missiles.
hmm,
Each time a new missile system is introduced, it does create some problems for the Russians, like the HIMARS when it first came. But now you don't even hear about it. It's very rare that a HIMARS gets through and does any real damage. Occasionally it does because there's no air defense system that's 100%. But they've learned how to, through electronic warfare and their air defense system, to bring them down with um, at close to 100%. And the same thing happened with Storm Shadows when they first were introduced. They did some real damage, and then the Russians figured them out. And now apparently the ATACMS are actually quite similar to the HIMARS, and they've already had some experience with them. So inevitably they will do some damage, but I think we can just rely on the fact that the Russians will figure out how to largely neutralize it.
hmm. I was looking up previous foreign aid packages to see what's the largest aid package that we've done that goes solely to foreign entities. Something
Mm-hmm.
comparable to this. During COVID, we spent $2.3 trillion, which was absurd. It went
Mm-hmm.
everywhere, but that was largely domestic and just
Mm-hmm.
ridiculous spending. But the one that I found that was most comparable was the Marshall Plan. After World War II,
Right.
the U.S. set aside $12 billion, which in today's dollars terms is almost 100 billion.
Right.
So it's very similar if you think about it.
Uh-huh.
But this was 12 billion to rebuild all of Western Europe after the destruction of
Right.
World War II.
Right.
So it just goes you to show, we've already put in hundreds of billions into Ukraine,
Right.
and now we're putting in another bill, $100 billion, which is equivalent to the size of the Marshall Plan, which we did after World War II, which we learn about in history as this huge effort and huge source of government resources to rebuild all of Western Europe. And I think, in a sense, it was largely successful. It created what we wanted. Probably set the basis for NATO, which ended up,
Uh-huh.
hurting us down the road. But I think what this aid package is showing is just how much waste there is. That this money is, you can put these large sums, but they don't actually equate to real results. Like, we're not actually able to provide any real assistance that makes a difference to these countries.
Right.
We just give is it just a money laundering scheme?
Yeah. Well, I think it's mostly. Well, yeah. I mean, money is a big part of it. I'm sure that the MIC lobbyists were pushing hard for this all along. Of course, they were, and what those lobbyists, the jobs that the congressmen can point to for their constituents. Say, thanks to this bill, we've employed 100 more people in such and such county or whatever. Yeah, that's just old fashioned pork barrel politics. That's a big part of it. But there's also it's also political theater. It's just the flag waving and all that. It's just standing with Ukraine, and it feels good. It looks good to them, and it looks pretty cringeworthy to me. But
Right.
Anybody who really knows what's going on. But it's theater. It's a show of support, and but it's support without substance.
Yeah. Well, I think this is just showing that the U.S. and the West just have a huge problem, and that's they don't have industrial capacity. They aren't able to produce things. You can give $1 million to the Russians and $100 million to the Americans, and the Russians will end up doing more with their million than we will do with our 100 million. Do you think that's fair to say?
It may be true. I don't know what the exact numbers, but it does seem.
But
to
it's
be,
kind of
right.
That's what I'm seeing is
right. Because even now, the U.S. outspends like the next 10 largest military spenders in the world. So in other words, the U.S. is way out in front. We spend close to $1 trillion a year or whatever on defense, and then China is way behind. Is second place, but it's just a fraction of that. It's like 20% of it, and then the Russians are behind the Chinese, and the Russians are in the middle of a war, yet they're still not spending anywhere near as much as we do.
Right,
and it's right. And
they're outproducing us.
That's the thing. It's right. They're right. We're getting 30,000 shells. We had to actually work to get up to 30,000 shells, artillery shells in this country, and nobody knows the exact figure, or at least I'm sure somebody knows, but we can't know for sure what the exact figure in Russia is. But it's probably more like 300,000 a month.
Yeah, my buddy TJ sent me a video the other day where it was somebody speaking up in Congress, and he was holding up a bag of screws.
Right.
Did you see this?
Bushings, right?
Oh, okay, yeah. And he was just saying that you can buy this at any hardware store for like less than $100. Do you know how much this cost the Pentagon?
Right.
$90,000 is what we charge. So it just shows you that that's the problem with the system, because the Pentagon can build a government, or Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. They can build a government. What they set the price, and there's only one buyer, and that buyer has a infinite checkbook. So they just say, okay, well, let's charge $90,000 for a couple of bolts.
Right.
And so that's why you get these systems that cost billions, and then politicians say, yeah, we're spending $1 trillion on our military, but we can only produce 550 Patriot missiles a year. We can't even produce 155 millimeter shells at 1/10 of the rate of the Russians, at 100th of the Chinese.
Right.
And so to me, it just shows just how the whole military industrial complex system is just is completely broken because it's not a true marketplace. It's a profit maximizing entity with only one
Yeah.
buyer, and
Well,
that.
yeah, it's not a true marketplace in Russia either, right? But
But it's state
but
directed
yeah,
in a way.
yeah, right. So that the problem is that you can have a state directed system that works real well, for something like this. Not for consumer items. That was a total disaster in the Soviet Union, but for military hardware, yes. Uh, and then but something that's neither here than there is just what it is. You're describing it quite well. It's just a cost plus. It's a corporate, it's a corrupt relationship between um, pseudo private enterprises and the government.
Right.
Which
And so we build, we build some cool stuff for sure, but they're not cost effective. Can't build at scale because we don't have the industrial base. So yeah, you just all of a sudden, this is, I think, an eye opener for a lot of people, at least for me. That's like, I always assumed, yeah, US number one by far. Look how much money we spend.
right,
And now I just realized, like, oh, we spend a lot
yeah,
of money, but it doesn't mean that
yeah,
we actually.
right. There's the same thing. Well, you find the same thing actually. I know seems entirely different, but I think it's the same problem. We spend a lot of money on education, like a lot more than other countries do, and we don't get better results. In fact, we tend to get worse results. But you always hear politicians bragging about how much money they spend on education. It's just sort of it becomes again, it's theater. It's a way of signaling your support and your commitment to something, but it doesn't tell you, if anything real is being achieved. So, yeah, we're sending $61 billion to Ukraine. Well, that sounds like a massive commitment, and we can just pat ourselves on the back about that. And we're standing up to that Putin and whatever, but it's just basically, yeah, you're just admitting that you spent a lot of money.
That's right. And they always say, the politicians always say, like, well, most it's all staying here in the US, 90% of it's staying here and helping people out. It's like, who's getting all that money? Is it just a few, like, really, really rich people that are in the MIC that are just filling their money bags each time? And they give a little few peanuts to the people below them, but is that how it works? Who are these super wealthy?
Yeah, well, yeah, sure. Of course, they had.
I bet you they're Jews. I'm just joking.
Actually, in this case, probably not. I mean, that's to be fair, probably not. There are other areas, certainly where that would be true. But I think talking about, these defense contractors. There isn't any particular Jewish dominance over that. And Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin. Yeah, there are a number of countries, not countries, they might as well be, but the other companies that really rake it in with these contracts. And of course, they're CEOs and the top management, you get a big chunk of it. There's no question about it. The lobbyists that they hire get a big chunk of it. And then, there are workers. It does trickle down and you do well. And then some of it comes back to the congressmen through the lobbyists. And it's been a kind of a very cozy, comfortable relationship for decades. And I don't think any of us really realize the extent of the corruption. And I knew that, there are stories going back to like the 1970s about the absurd costs, of really everyday items that the Pentagon uses. I remember, right. I think back, it may have been the 70s, where there was a congressman pointing out that a hammer cost, like $100, which is a huge amount of money these days, or a toilet seat was, there were right. People were bringing these up, just like the guy with the bushings. So obviously the problem's never been solved. But you always assumed that, well, okay, yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of waste, but we got some real good weapons, I'm sure. And, the U.S. is clearly number one. Maybe the U.S. is still number one, but, I'm not quite sure about that anymore.
I don't think so, because, well, I mean, a lot of it, I think what we've learned is in the 21st century war is that a lot of these things that the U.S. military has don't really matter. Things like Bradleys or Abram tanks or our whole Navy.
I think it was somebody who was just pointing out there was an Abrams tank that cost $50 million.
I think, yeah, or was it even 100 million?
Yes,
Anyways,
yes, okay,
but
yeah,
blown up with $100 drone, right?
yeah. Maybe it wasn't $100, but a
Or
thousand, $500 drone or something like
yeah,
that, right? And that happens. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you wonder if it really tanks have a future. I mean, the Russians keep on churning them out, but they're trying to adapt them. So they now have. Sometimes you see these sort of funky Russian tanks that have something that clearly was added on afterwards, kind of. And then there's the famous like turtle, something that looks like it's a moving shed that's going around. Um, and I think they're just experimenting. And what I understand is like the most recent models that are coming out of the factories do have EW, electronic warfare units integrated into them, and other defenses against drones. So maybe they're going to figure out how
we were
to.
talking about
The
Russians that
Russians,
are building this,
yeah,
yeah.
the Russians,
And in
right?
the
So
U.S., we seem to not be able to change. Nothing is developed in terms of our
no,
technical. We
right,
spend all this money, but we talked about this before.
right,
Haven't actually evolved any of our
right.
technical military capabilities.
Yeah, to my knowledge, we haven't. I mean, it just there are there may be. I'm sure there are people within the Pentagon that are realize what's happening in there. But again, I don't see any signs of this very cozy relationship. It's just like there's really we haven't woken up to the reality. And people are still living, are very comfortable with the idea that the U.S. is number one, and as long as we just keep on forking over the dollars, we'll remain number one. And yeah, I haven't, nobody's gotten really up, has stood up. Maybe the closest we had to a speech, like in the Senate, that well, it wasn't a speech; it was an article that J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, wrote, and he did point out the problem with the production. And
Right.
that was like the one senator who's actually done that. So like, there's the beginnings of like a little bit of reality dawning right there, but he's very much the exception to the rule.
Mm.
And yeah, the rest of them just seem to be have not woken up to the new reality. They're not talking about really changing carrying out some really serious reforms within the military industrial complex.
So, in terms of the Ukraine conflict, you think this will have very little impact? It'll
Well, yeah, so far, I mean, it's just that, uh, again, it's just like um, the reformers, the realists are just on the fringes. They don't have any real power. It's the same old people that are still driving policy, and um, if there's going to be a change, it will take a disaster. Again, it's just too many people are too comfortable with the way things are.
mm.
They have these very comfortable relationships, with lobbyists and defense industries, and and yeah, they don't see any
Mm.
reason to change. They
So
think,
right. So, I mean, just to focus on the Ukraine theater. So maybe Ukraine might be able to have some more offensive capabilities with attack guns, but ultimately that just means that Russia's going to go after them even harder, right? If
yeah,
they hit
but
anything
and
on.
there are only so many attackums. Apparently we're not even making them anymore,
Mm.
and we can't. We're giving a certain number. I don't know how many, but we can't give them too much because we have other theaters.
Right. That's what I'm understanding is just that we're having some real munitions issues that we
Right.
can't really supply. Now we're trying to, and then this is what makes it even crazier. So let's pivot now from Ukraine to Israel. We give 26 million to Israel. From my understanding, a large part of it is to replenish their air defense system because it was severely depleted after that Iranian attack.
Right.
Because I think for every drone missile comes in, they send out 2 interceptors that cost a ton of money.
Right. Right.
And even from my understanding on the Iranian drone missile attack, more than half of those drones and missiles were shot down by the United
Right.
States. So even
And the UK
and
and
the UK,
France. Right.
right? So, but not
Right.
Israel.
Right.
So Israel has shown that it doesn't have the capability to defend itself
Right.
without its allies. And this was a small drone attack.
Right.
So this money we're going to send 26 billion to Israel. What does that mean for Israel? What does that mean for the situation in the Middle East?
Well, yeah, I think again it demonstrates to Netanyahu that it doesn't matter what Israel does. The U.S. is always going to back him up. I mean, that's the he's been operating on that assumption. So you hear about the criticisms, that the administration has directed against Israel, and especially again its conduct of the war in Gaza, and the so-called pressure that they're putting on it. Yeah, but when push comes to shove, the U.S. is always there. The U.S. was there with their aircraft in the air and their ships that were not only did were their U.S. planes shooting down drones and cruise missiles, but there were also um, destroyers, with their air defense systems that were integrated into the Israeli air defense system to supplement it. That were part of this. So we were there backing them up 100%. And now we give him $26 billion, more in arms. What does he have to worry about? After all these horrible atrocities.
Well, you should have to worry about, because you should realize that even if with $26 billion, it doesn't mean anything. There's nothing to buy with that $26 billion. That's what I think these countries that people need to understand is that this money to buy military assistance you're buying way overpriced goods that will run out quickly.
Well, I think probably it means something for Gaza. We have the kinds of like dumb bombs, whatever, that the Israelis are just dropping on indiscriminately on buildings in Gaza. So it's just that, they'll have an endless supply of bombs. Nobody's saying that we're running out of bombs yet. Yeah. But air defense, that's a real problem. That clearly is. And it's interesting. I read an analysis of I guess it was April 13th, and when this happened, of Israel's and the U.S.'s air defense. There's Theodore Postel is a professor, I believe, emeritus from MIT, a leading expert in missile technology, and he's done a lot of analysis previously on incidents in Syria and so on. He spent a lot of time going over, every video that he could find. And he came to some very interesting conclusions. And one is that he couldn't find any interception of a ballistic missile. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but not in the videos that he looked at. He didn't see any. Now, he found many interceptions of drones and of cruise missiles. But all of them were air to air. In other words, it was, aircraft, either U.S. or Israeli or French or whatever, firing missiles. I think most of them, he said, were probably Sidewinder missiles, each of which cost $500,000, $500,000, and to take out these drones. But he said there's no evidence that the Iron Dome took out anything. He could not find it. Yeah. Now they also the Israelis also have something called the Arrow, I think I mentioned earlier, and David's Sling,
right?
And that may have taken out some ballistic missiles, maybe higher up, and that's one reason that we don't have any video evidence of it. But he could not find any evidence that the Iron Dome did anything.
So Israel's really been exposed from this.
Right.
Like they don't have the capabilities to defend from missiles, and neither does the United States.
Right.
And
he also came up with a kind of an incident that I forgot about. I think it was 2018. There was an attack that was carried out on a Saudi oil refinery, and nobody knows exactly where it comes from. There's a lot of, it seems to be, it was probably carried out by the Houthis, but with Iranian produced weapons. And, you look at the photographs that were taken later, there were these 4 tanks, and you can see each one has a hole in it, and the hole is in exactly the same place. So these missile strikes were precise within like a foot, just extraordinary. And it did very significant damage, to this facility in Saudi Arabia. And now the reason I bring this up is that this was guarded by a number of U.S. supplied air defense systems, including the Patriot. And it was a major embarrassment for the U.S. at the time. And they said, well, okay, our Patriot really isn't geared to dealing with drones and slow-moving missiles. Or I think it was actually some missiles that, like a cruise missile, low-flying cruise missile, that could evade the radar. And then they also blamed the Saudi operators. But anyway, I think that right there was actually back then, the Iranians, revealed the weakness of America's air defense systems.
Okay.
And then again, the Israelis have their own system, the Iron Dome, but it's supplemented with American systems.
And the Israeli so-called retaliation response to that Iranian attack kind of, I think, also proved our offensive incapabilities.
Yeah.
That
Well,
that
certainly Israeli.
Israeli, but
Yeah.
I even would say like, right, okay, let's say the Israelis, they don't seem to have the ability to strike very far. It
Yeah.
seems like what they rely on are aircraft,
Right.
their planes to
Right.
deliver payloads, to shoot
Right.
missiles. They're not able to actually launch drones and
Right.
missiles from the land
Right.
like Iran can do.
Right.
Iran can
Exactly.
just, they have these cheap little, I've seen them kind of like these little elevated runways for the drones just to kind of just pop off
Yeah.
and take into the air.
Right.
And then they, like we were saying, they cost about as much as a lawnmower, and they can just fly over. In the
Right.
U.S. and Israel, they, well, like we said before, the U.S. just doesn't have the ability to produce at scale. We have the ability to produce some drones, like our Predator drones, but they cost millions of dollars, take a long time to produce.
Right.
They're not able to perform the function that's required in modern warfare, which is air defense and swarm missile tactics,
Uh-huh.
swarm drone and missile, which it seems
They're
like
good for assassinations and for reconnaissance, I think, basically.
right. So I think this has really shown a kind of a weakness in our offensive capabilities as well.
Yeah.
Would
Well,
you
yeah.
agree?
I mean, that attack didn't really show anything about, I think, U.S. capabilities, because the U.S. Um, apparently kept out of it.
Do we
So
have the capabilities? But we don't have
well,
hypersonic weapons.
right, right,
If we
that's
can't
true.
use the airspace
Right,
in Saudi Arabia or Qatar or
right. Well, we can.
Jordan,
Yeah, the thing is, we can use it from Iraq. We have those bases there, and we
for
have
now,
control for now.
until we use them
Yeah,
against Iran, then we
yeah.
won't have them anymore.
Right. Well, it's true. And also the Iraqis really want to kick us out, but we won't go. Um, so, yeah, we do have control over the Iraqi airspace, and we do have a formidable, you know, Air Force. We have a lot of planes.
But like I'm just saying that
Yeah.
the problem is now, I think that in the 21st century, we're, back in the day, World War II, World War One, yeah, having big boats and tanks were important, and then
Yeah.
throughout the Soviet Union, having aircraft and fighter jets matter. But in the 21st century, it really doesn't matter as much with your aircraft. It's more about your
Right.
missiles.
Right.
Right?
Or often it's the aircraft are really platforms for launching the missiles. I mean, they can serve that purpose, like they do for the Russians. And it's, those glide bombs are, dropped, launched by the aircraft, and the number of their missiles, including the Kinjal hypersonic, is launched by aircraft.
Right, but that's because they got
Right.
rid of the air defense systems. They're able to do that, right?
Yeah. Actually, they could do it before, but now they just can come in a lot closer. Because like a lot of these glide bombs, you can be launched from 50 kilometers away or whatever. But now they can, so before they stayed off farther out, I mean, now they can come right up to the front lines. And I think recently there was a glide bomb that went all the way to Kharkov, which shows that, there just isn't much air defense left in Ukraine.
Mm. Okay, well, let's go to the last country. We haven't really talked much about China and Taiwan at all,
Yeah.
but that's also an interesting situation there. So we've given, you said, approximately $10 billion to Taiwan.
Right.
And my understanding right now, I think that's more interesting than just the military aid. Obviously, that's going to antagonize China further.
Yeah.
We say we supported this agreement of this one child China
Yeah.
policy, but we're clearly going against it right now.
Right.
But our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, is currently in Beijing meeting with Xi Jinping. I
Right.
saw him get off the plane. Hardly anybody was there to greet him. No red carpet.
Yeah,
China's
I think
already giving him the cold shoulder.
Right. I think I heard was it Olaf Scholz, who was the deputy mayor of Beijing, showed up.
So
Which
not
is
even the mayor.
Yeah, right. I don't know who's showing up for Anthony Blinken, but yeah.
Yeah. So, but from my understanding is that Anthony Blinken is going to try to play a very dangerous, difficult game with
Yeah.
China by saying basically, China, you can't do trade with Russia and engage basically in your normal trade operations. You don't
Right.
want any selling any chips, or we're going to sanction
Or
you.
machine tools.
Or anything to help Russia in any way to produce basically anything, which is absurd because we just passed a $95 billion
Right.
bill to give
Yeah.
direct military assistance to Ukraine,
Yeah.
and
Right.
and we're upset if China sells chips to
Yeah.
Russia. But anyways, it sounds like that we are going to threaten China with sanctions, sanction their financial sector.
Right. I think even cut banks off from the SWIFT system. or
Really?
yeah, for certain banks.
This is suicidal. Like we
Yeah,
were talking about ending the U.S. dollar and the Western financial system, this
right.
global hegemony. This is a quick fire way to do it. Do you think that's actually going to happen? That we would be so stupid as to sanction China, the manufacturing power of the world?
Yeah, right. I mean,
Everything
it really
is
sent.
made here. Everything is like without China, we are nothing.
Yeah,
And we want to sanction them. Like, how do we
yeah,
think this is going to play out?
right. Well, it just makes me think of a saying in Chinese, "自不量力," which means like a, a failure to recognize or properly appreciate your own strength. And
Hmm.
that's like we go in there talking like, well, it's the 1990s when we could just go in and do those kind of things. And everybody, China was relatively weak, very dependent on us for economic development. And yeah, with a military that was vastly inferior to ours. And we could just, willy nilly, apply sanctions and without fearing consequences. Um, but it's the world's changed. The balance of power has
Surely,
changed.
we've
Right.
been placing sanctions on Russia for the past 2 years.
Right.
Every month there's a new sanction package,
Right.
and every time we do it, nothing. Russia brushes it off. Russia's economy is booming now.
Right.
There's a very optimistic
Right.
mood
Well,
in
yeah.
Russia.
Right.
Like we said before, their GDP growth was greater than all the G7 countries,
Right.
and it looks to be on track for an even better
Right.
year this year.
Right. Well, that's partly what's motivating Anthony Blinken is that he's saying, okay, our sanctions have failed because now they're pointing the finger at China because China's still trading with Russia. So maybe if we just put the screws on China and get them to
Does he
cut
actually
back.
think that China would comply and say like, okay, we're not going to?
Yeah. Well, it's I
Because
don't know.
China is
Right.
obviously
Right.
that, and we're doing this. We're going
Right.
over. What's so crazy is that we're going over there to put pressure on China, say, "Hey, stop doing
Yeah.
this with Russia. Stick
Right.
with us." But at the same time, we're sending $10 billion worth of military equipment to
Yeah.
arm Taiwan and say, "Taiwan, you got to fight China,"
Right.
and
Right.
that the
Yeah.
U.S.
No.
we
I
got to
mean
stand.
that.
Like
Right.
how?
Right.
Well,
Right. I
do
mean
you think
they.
China is stupid? What
Yeah.
do they think?
Well, I'm sure they're just. I'm sure they're furious. For one thing, that
When you say they, you're
hey,
talking about
yeah,
the
the
Chinese.
Chinese. Yes, I'm talking about the Chinese. I'm sure that they are, and that so blatantly hypocritical that I just it seems like even a politician would have trouble going on. Making these statements that Anthony Blinken's is making. Making these threats because it's just again anybody just look at what are you doing? First of all, we have a perfect right to trade with who we want, and then who are you? You're not okay. You're not the behemoth. The master of the universe that you used to be. We produce a lot more than you. You're greatly in debt, and to a great extent, dependent on our
In debt to
good.
China.
Right, exactly, to our goodwill. Obviously there are things that China can do to hurt the U.S. if the U.S. is going to try to hurt China. I mean, it's just like this is not a country that's incapable of fighting back. And then again, I'm sure the Chinese want to avoid a trade war. I'm sure because they still make a lot of money off of the U.S. But it's not like before, where they were highly dependent on the U.S. For their economic well-being. It's just other parts of the world, outside of Europe and the U.S. are now becoming very important trading partners. Russia, India, the global South in general, and I think they now account for a majority of their
Exports.
exports. So it's just not the same situation. They don't, again, there's been this shift, and it seems like the U.S. is just not really hasn't come to terms with it. A shift in the balance of power. It does seem to me very foolish. The Chinese will do something to make a show of accommodating U.S. demands just to avoid a trade war, avoid escalation, because just like the Iranians, they don't want to get into an all-out trade war, slapping sanctions back and forth. They see that as a destructive path. So they might do some things that are symbolic, really, but don't really change their trade relationship with Russia. But I'm sure in the long term, they're just looking at this, they say that, we've got every reason now to reorient ourselves. They were already understanding this, but this has got to just confirm them in their previous understanding that we really need to reorient from away from the U.S. and towards BRICS. It's
Mm.
just like this: the U.S. is not a reliable partner. The U.S. is clearly hostile. The U.S. is finding ways to harm us. Um, and it seems to me that they can't. It would be a huge mistake for China to cave in and just give them what they want, because that just gives the U.S. an incentive to
And
make more
they're
threats.
not going to do that.
Yeah,
That's
no, I don't
clear.
think so. I don't see that
Right.
happening.
Well, yeah,
And
I heard also that one of the reasons Blinken's over there is that there is fear that China, along with the BRICS countries, are making a new financial system, a new
right,
financial infrastructure that doesn't rely on the dollar or the
right,
U.S., which is clear that that is happening, and so
right,
that the idea is to sanction a lot of the financial sector of China, like you said, potentially banning from SWIFT, something like this. But isn't it? To me, it's just so clear that doing this type of thing just proves China's point
right,
that we have to have another financial
right,
system
right,
because they're threatening to cut you off at any moment. And that's what they're doing right now. So
right,
this is just going to expedite
right.
the decline of
Yeah,
the
clearly
the
it would.
dollar.
It's hard to believe that we'd be that stupid. Yeah, I've heard the same rumors that that's what's behind this. But it seems like if you want to persuade them not to build up an alternative
Right.
financial
Show
system,
them that you're fair,
right?
that you can
Exactly.
work in the
So
system, that
yeah, so
we don't.
it's hard to believe that they'd be that stupid, but they
Right.
could very well be
The
that
way
stupid.
to save the dollar is
Yeah,
to let the dollar be
a truly
right, a
neutral,
truly
right,
neutral currency
right.
that isn't one power won't use over another constantly and
As a weapon
threat.
against, right,
Right, you can't weaponize the dollar if you
right.
want it to be an international
Right.
currency.
But I think it's actually right. It would just be further proof, but we don't even really need any more proof. We've seen what the U.S. has done to Russia and to Iran and to other countries around the world, Venezuela and so
Right.
forth. And China has seen it. The whole world has seen it. And then, we see the discussions in Europe about seizing, Russian assets. And just recently, what was it part of the same bill, or was it a previous bill that the Congress went ahead and gave permission to seize Russian assets in the U.S.?
Yeah,
Right.
it's crazy. So do you think, just going back to one more time, do you think China, the United States, will actually try to sanction China? Will actually be so crazy as to say that China can't be part of the SWIFT system, try to cut them off? I mean, it's concerning for me because
Yeah.
my business is in China.
Right.
Like
Yeah. Yeah. No, I can understand. Um, well, it's just like I can never say that. There's so many things they say. Well, we can't be that stupid, and then we turn out to be that stupid. So it just seems, it seems crazy. But he's making these threats. The fact that he's made these threats public, it's actually put pressure on him to carry through if the Chinese don't comply, right? I mean, and if the Chinese, if they call our bluff, we don't do anything, then that's a major setback for the U.S. So it kind of, again, it puts us in a difficult position. You've made the threat, you got to carry through on it.
I feel like we constantly put ourselves in this lose situation.
Yeah.
With every one of these with China, with Israel, with Ukraine, and Russia, every single time we were just in a position where we find out that we lose either way we go, and we keep on going down these.
Yeah.
Instead of just stopping it, we just
Right.
keep on going
Yeah.
down this road of just death and destruction and monetary loss and
Right.
decline of global power. Okay, well, we'll see. So, do you think that we'll find out in the next week or so that whether this happens? I mean, he's there now.
Yeah. Well, we should. Again, there may be a lot of sort of diplomatic speak that will have to be,
Interpreted.
interpreted and studied, and then we'll have to wait for the readouts and then further sciences sometimes. But it seems like that it's going to do damage to the Sino-U.S. relations. There's no question about it. In the long run, without a question, and probably in the short run as well.
If the U.S. goes along with these sanctions, then I assume that they'll tell all of their European puppets to do the same, right?
Yeah, of course. Right.
So will we expect? It just seems such like a dumb move because it just means that I feel like we're going to see inflation take off in all of these countries that participate in the sanctions.
Yeah, well, it's especially damaging for Europe. We've already destroyed their economic relationship with Russia, which was really very important to Europe. Russia was not economically very important to us, but it was very important to Europe, to Germany in particular. Now, Germany's in a real fix. Now, that's one reason that Olaf Scholz was there in China not long ago.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, we'll probably try to start twisting the German arm and getting them to uh, try to sanction.
Do you think that the Europeans would push back? Because that would be
Right.
interesting to see.
Yeah.
Because
Well,
if
you would think they would, but I mean, a country that actually just took the Nord Stream, without a squeak of complaint, they're capable of any kind of cowardice, and I mean, they're just hardly worthy of the name of a country anymore. I
mm,
mean, really, it's just
just U.S. vassals, huh?
yeah, pathetic leadership. So there certainly will be business leaders that are very unhappy about it, and some politicians. But I mean, it's such a pathetic crew that runs that country that I wouldn't have any reason to expect that they're really going to protest in a meaningful way.
Unbelievable. It's hard for me to believe that we would actually try to sanction China. This is
Yeah,
going to end disastrously.
right.
But if there's one thing that I can bet on, it's just that whatever decision our administration makes, it'll be the wrong one. So I guess
Yeah.
here we go. Sanctions against China. We're going to see. We're going to see. I think this will cause more domestic unrest in the Western world. I think a lot of times these conflicts like Ukraine, what's happening in Israel and Gaza, for many people, just on their TV screens, they're not going to see it or feel it.
Hmm.
When we start messing with China,
Well, certainly the
people will feel
potential,
it.
right?
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, right. If for example, if the Chinese start to
do a tit for tat.
yeah, right. They can do us an awful lot of damage. We're very, very dependent on China in so many ways, financially, fiscally, and yeah, in terms of trade.
Mm. Okay, well, I think we can stop there. We'll see what happens.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Dad.